Blenheim Palace is the only non-royal, non-episcopal house in England to hold the title of palace, and it's probably most famous as the home of Winston Churchill. But there's so much more to it than that. These grounds are bursting with all the thrills and spills of history. This has been the home of weird Art Deco eyes, a Roman sarcophagus, and maybe even a medieval labyrinth. And the drama which has happened here is worthy of a Shakespearean epic. There have been clashes between queens and duchesses and royal mistresses. There have been national heroes and mischievous schoolboys. And let us not forget the most undervalued character of all, a porcupine. It's bursting with history and riddled with secrets. So, without further ado, let's get to it. These are the secrets of Blenheim Palace.
This area of the Oxfordshire countryside, just near a town called Woodstock, is a pretty remarkable place, because it's been the home of not one, but two palaces. The first was built in the 12th century.
In 1129, King Henry I built a hunting lodge here and had 7 miles of wall built to create the first enclosed park, where he kept lions and camels and even England's first porcupine. His grandson, King Henry II, turned the hunting lodge into a grand palace named Woodstock Palace.
Henry II spent much time at Woodstock, holding important councils and royal weddings. It was at Woodstock that he had his first clash with Thomas Becket. It was also here that it said King Henry II built a secret cloistered retreat for his mistress, Rosamund Clifford, which could only be reached via a labyrinth of paths. The idea was to keep her hidden from Henry's formidable queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine.
But Queen Eleanor was savvy and, as it turns out, good at mazes. The story goes she navigated the labyrinth, confronted fair Rosamund and forced her to choose between the dagger and a bowl of poison. Rosamund chose the latter and died.
Woodstock Palace no longer exists, but part of what is supposedly fair Rosamund's hideaway can still be seen.
This is a pool known as Fair Rosamund's Well. It's said to be supplied by a spring that never stops flowing. A likely story.
Woodstock Palace was also familiar to many of England's kings and queens, especially Elizabeth I, who spent nearly a year under house arrest during the reign of her sister, Queen Mary I.
Elizabeth even scratched the following words on one of the windows: "Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be, quoth Elizabeth, prisoner."
Henry II's royal manor was attacked during the English Civil War. By the 18th century, it was derelict and crumbling. It seemed the glory days for this plot of land were well and truly over.
Not quite. This was to change after the monumental events of the 13th of August 1704. Far away from the sleepy Oxfordshire countryside in a place in southern Germany known as Blenheim or Blenheim, over 100,000 men prepared to fight.
The ensuing bloodshed became one of the major battles of the War of the Spanish Succession, the Battle of Blenheim. Once more, it was a tremendous victory for allied English, Dutch and Austrian armies. Bavaria was knocked out of the war, and Louis XIV's hopes of an early victory were destroyed.
One of the factors of the Allied success was the brilliant leadership of John Churchill, the Duke of Marloborough. It was a textbook example of planning, logistics, tactical and operational skill.
Marlborough's close attention to detail was worth it. Not only did he come home in glory, with battle being compared to Agincourt, but in 1705 he was given one of the most generous gifts in history.
We're not talking a bottle of champagne or a free holiday here, or even a couple of VIP tickets to Wimbledon. Parliament promised to build him a palace. And where would this palace be? Well, here at the Royal Manor of Woodstock. And so John Churchill, the only Briton ever to have risen from a commoner to a duke in one generation, was given money by Parliament to build himself a cosy getaway in the countryside. He built this.
The inscription above the east gate tells us that Blenheim was built between 1705 and 1722 under the auspices of a munificent sovereign. However, the Treasury only contributed £240,000 to the initial cost, and the Marlboroughs spent a further £60,000 completing it.
That's because the Duke's wife, Sarah Churchill, was quite a fiery character. She fell out with Queen Anne, forcing the Marlboroughs to spend 2 years in voluntary exile. She fell out with the architect Vanbrugh too, who was banned from the site and replaced by his assistant, Hawksmoor, halfway through the project. It would have made an excellent episode of Grand Designs.
Despite the drama, the combined efforts of Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor made this one of the best examples of English Baroque architecture, perhaps only rivalled by Castle Howard in Yorkshire.
This architecture is theatrical, heavily three-dimensional, almost grotesque in its lavish use of curves and embellishments. Although there are classical elements, columns, colonnades and archways, little attention is paid to proportion. In fact, everything here seems to overwhelm you with exaggeration.
It is truly monumental in scale. The site of the palace covers some 7 acres. It required stone from 20 different quarries across the country and an army of 1,500 workmen.
In more recent years, repainting the interiors took 7 years and rewiring them took another 7 years, by which time you probably need to repaint them again.
But Blenheim wasn't really built as a palace to be lived in. It was first and foremost a monument to a great warrior and an epic battle. And everywhere you look are clues, some of them not so subtle.
Look, there are cannonballs everywhere. Look at this enormous entrance portico on the north front. It resembles more the entrance of a pantheon than a family home. And down below are sculptures showing the trophies of war.
On the clock tower, the English lion has the French cockerel in its claws.
In the northern part of the park stands an 134 feet tall column of victory. It's crowned by a lead statue of the first Duke of Marlborough and shows him dressed as a Roman general, with eagles at his feet and a winged victory in his hand.
The Marlboroughs even built their very own triumphal arch, known as the Woodstock Gate, which was based on the Arch of Titus in Rome. And it feels pretty grand on the inside too. The Great Hall has a 67-foot high ceiling, exactly half the height of the column outside. And there he is, the first Duke of Marlborough, kneeling to Britannia and presenting a map of the Battle of Blenheim.
We've got the arms of Queen Anne in the keystone and Corinthian columns and pilasters, all carved by Gridden and Gibbons. And the inscription over here describing the first Duke reads, "Nor could Augustus better calm mankind." Everything here is done on a ducal scale. The lock on these huge doors is said to be modelled on those of the city of Warsaw. So it's really simple. All you've got to do is, just go like that, right to the right. Is that the right way? Yeah, it's really easy. Then this comes down. Is that right? Okay. And then simply open the door. Ah, hello.
This is the saloon, used by the current Duke once a year for Christmas dinner.
As well as Queen Anne and Vanbrugh, Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, also fell out with James Thornhill, the guy who painted that big ceiling next door. So Louis Laguerre, the French artist, was called in. And when he painted this crowd on the wall in trompe-l'oeil and 3D, as if they're actually here, he included himself.
There are plenty more Battle of Blenheim clues in this room too, most notably the Duke riding to victory on the ceiling.
I'm starting to get the feeling that the first Duke of Marlborough might have been quite a boring person to sit next to at a dinner party, beginning every other sentence with, "Oh, that really reminds me of this time at the Battle of Blenheim," or "It's funny you should say that because when I was writing the dispatch after the Battle of Blenheim," or "That's hilarious, it's just like Blenheim." We know John Churchill, we get it.
This is one of the 30 historic clocks which have to be changed twice a year.
Before Greenwich Mean Time, aka GMT, was universally adopted, the fourth Duke of Marlborough introduced his very own Blenheim time. They measured it by using a sundial combined with the specific longitude of the palace in relation to Greenwich.
There are several staterooms at Blenheim, all hung with tapestries showing Marlborough's victories.
But the most intriguing item in this room is a piece of paper. It appears to be a bill from a French tavern listing meat and wine and the prices. But on the right side of the paper is a scrawled letter, for this is the copy of the Blenheim Dispatch, a letter which the first Duke wrote from the battlefield to his wife Sarah Churchill. This bill was the only piece of paper he had to hand, and it reads, "I have not time to say any more, but to beg you will give me my duty to the Queen, and let her know her army has had a glorious victory." Another incredible object in these rooms is this French royal standard with its 3 fleurs-de-lis. Now, Marlborough wasn't actually given the land here. The land was still owned by Queen Anne, so he was renting it from the crown. But it was a pretty good deal. All he had to do once a year, on or before the anniversary of the battle, was present a standard bearing the fleur-de-lis of France. This tradition continues to this day, and if someone forgets, then it all reverts to the crown.
This is the Long Library. Originally planned as a room to hang paintings, it is now home to more than 10,000 books.
The Annual Register of 1825. I love that one.
At one end, it's got a magnificent statue of Queen Anne. Queen Anne played an important role at Blenheim because she was best friends with Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, until they fell out. It was a turbulent relationship, dramatised in the film The Favourite.
Despite falling out with Queen Anne, Sarah Churchill seemed to remember her old friend fondly and commissioned this full-size statue. Sarah wrote in 1735, "I am going to Rysbrack, who was the artist, to make a bargain with him for a fine statue of Queen Anne, which I will put up in the book window room with a proper inscription. It will be a very fine thing, and though one figure will cost me £300, I have satisfaction in showing this respect to her, because her kindness to me was real, and what happened afterwards was compassed by the contrivance of such as are in power now."
This is quite a flattering portrayal of the Queen, made over 2 decades after she died. For Anne suffered from illnesses which made her obese. As Sarah put it, Anne grew exceedingly gross and corpulent. There was something of majesty in her look, but mixed with a gloominess of soul. When Anne died in 1714, aged 49, she was placed in a coffin described by one onlooker as so wide it was almost square. The palace chapel contains the ornate tomb and sarcophagus of the first Duke and Duchess.
Here is the first Duke, dressed as a Roman general, with their 2 sons who both died young. Of course, their 5 daughters are not included in this family group. On either side of the sarcophagus are 2 large statues. This figure with the quill is history, and this figure with the trumpet is fame. And crushed underneath is envy.
It's bizarre to think that, as the chapel was not finished when the first Duke died in 1722, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, where he lay for 22 years. When Sarah died in 1744, his body was brought back to Blenheim and reinterred in the crypt of this chapel.
Sarah Churchill insisted that the rest of the chapel be kept simple, as to not distract from her husband's glory. She wrote that the chapels were too often decorated with all sorts of wonderful figures and whirligigs, so ornate that they were only useful to laugh at. The building of Blenheim attracted a great deal of attention, and not for all the right reasons. Alexander Pope wrote to a friend, "It is the most inhospitable thing imaginable. In a word, the whole is a most expensive absurdity." The Duke of Shrewsbury described it as a great quarry of stones above the ground. Sounds like someone was jealous.
The original gardens here were designed in a formal style, like those at Versailles, but by the mid-18th century, the fashions had changed. In 1764, the landscape architect Lancelot Capability Brown was called in to update it in a more naturalistic style. One of the things he did was flood the area to create a great lake, so when you look at this bridge, which dates from 1708, you're only seeing the top half.
In fact, this was designed as a habitable viaduct with 30 rooms, including, apparently, a ballroom and a theatre. When the lake was drained a few years ago, they found original plasterwork, stairways, tunnels, cooking ranges, chimneys, fireplaces, and even some 18th century graffiti.
The Dukes of Marlborough maintained a high status in British society, entertaining the high and mighty for the following centuries. But it was the second wife of the 9th Duke who really made her mark here. Gladys Deacon was a French-American aristocrat and socialite.
Now, Gladys was famed for her beauty, but she was one of the first cases of botched plastic surgery. In her early 20s, she underwent a plastic surgery attempt in which she had her nose injected with paraffin wax. It slipped to her chin and caused big lumps. But despite this, her beautiful blue eyes were captured forever here on the portico ceiling in front of the main doors of Blenheim Palace.
They were painted in 1928, and she is said to have climbed the scaffolding to give the artist a blue silk scarf to get the shade exactly correct.
And her perfect Grecian features were also immortalised as 2 matching sphinxes in the lower watered terraces.
Of course, Blenheim is most famous as the birthplace of Winston Churchill, who was born in this very flowery room. But this was actually an accident. It was all rather sudden, for Winston was 2 months premature.
His father recorded that a rather imprudent and rough drive in a pony carriage brought on the pains on Saturday night, and before a doctor could arrive from London, Winston had arrived himself. "The boy is wonderfully pretty," his father wrote, "so everybody says, and very healthy, considering its prematureness." And you can even see some of Churchill's curls. Here are Sir Winston Churchill's curls cut from his head when he was 5 years old. Churchill remembered Blenheim fondly. "At Blenheim," he said, "I took 2 very important decisions, to be born and to marry. I am content with the decision I took on both occasions. For it was here at the Temple of Diana that the young Clementine Hosier was enjoying the summer sunshine, and Winston Churchill approached her and proposed." So she was just waiting here. Any minute, I think. Any minute now. This is one of my favourite items you can look at Blenheim Palace, Churchill's burgundy siren suit.
Churchill had a variety of siren suits, which he referred to as romper suits, which he could slip on over his clothes in the event of an air raid. Apparently, they were often damaged and returned to his Jermyn Street shirt maker for repair, where it turned out the damage wasn't from enemy action, but cigar burns.
Churchill actually became very fond of this casual wear, opting to sport it for the most formal of occasions. He actually wore one on a visit to the White House in Washington in December 1941. And at a press conference later that week, Mrs. Roosevelt declared that she was going to have one made for her husband too. So although we might remember Churchill as a statesman, was his real legacy the invention of the onesie?
Churchill was buried close to Blenheim too, in the nearby village churchyard at Blaydon alongside his mother and father. If you look out from the salon portico, you can see Blaydon Church. So the north-south axis of the palace connects the column of victory of the first Duke in the north with the grave of Winston Churchill in the south. At the start of the Second World War, Blenheim Palace welcomed 400 boys evacuated from their school, Malvern College, and it was also used by MI5 and the British Council.
The Great Hall became the dining room, huts filled the formal gardens for classrooms, the long library and the staterooms became dormitories, and to protect the works of art in the palace, only pencils and not pens were allowed. And when an epidemic broke out, the long library became the hospital wing, with German measles at one end and mumps at the other.
The crowning glory of the Long Library is this organ, an instrument which has entertained everyone from kings, emperors to wounded soldiers.
Kaiser Wilhelm II listened to a recital of Wagner and Handel when he visited in 1899 and compared this organ to the steering of a great battleship. And there's quite a sweet note on the front too. It reads, "To memory of happy days, and as a tribute to this glorious home, we leave thy voice to speak within these walls in years to come, when ours are still."
But whilst this organ was supposed to have 2,300 pipes, after the visit of the Malvern schoolboys, there were only 2,297. 3 of the smallest pipes were missing.
The school coughed up, of course, but the mystery was never solved until many decades later they turned up in the post out of the blue. It turned out that one of the boys had stolen the pipes as a bit of a joke, but never quite plucked up the courage to admit it. It was a secret he took to the grave, for it was his widow who finally sent them back.
Perhaps it's no surprise that Blenheim has had its fair share of Hollywood film crews. Mission Impossible, The Young Victoria and Gulliver's Travels were all filmed here, and most glamorous of all, a Walker's Crisp advert with Victoria Beckham.
And it was here in the Great Court that Daniel Craig, playing James Bond in the film Spectre, parked his Aston Martin and snuck inside the palace to join a meeting. And of course, he soon leaves the meeting by jumping through one of these windows, running along the colonnades, and jumping out from behind the columns and whizzing away in the Aston. The name's Loxton. Alice Loxton. And you might recognise this 55-foot cedar of Lebanon. This tree plays a starring role in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, during a flashback scene of schoolboy Snape being bullied by the young James Potter. Flue powder.
Blenheim is, of course, often in the news. Not long ago, it made headlines because an art installation of a golden toilet seat was stolen. But my favourite story revolves around this item.
For 200 years, this great tub was used to decorate the garden, first as a water feature and later as a rather splendid flower pot. But one day it caught the eye of an antiques expert who happened to be visiting, and he thought there might be more to the story. His hunch was correct, for this is a 1,700-year-old Roman sarcophagus. The carvings show a drunken Dionysus leaning on a satyr at a party, flanked by the likes of Hercules and Ariadne, and two large lion heads. It's valued at £300,000. That's a pretty pricey flower pot. So there it is, the history of Blenheim Palace in a nutshell. It's without a doubt the most impressive private house I've ever visited, but it doesn't feel particularly cosy, and I think Alexander Pope's 1714 verse sums it up. It goes, "See, sir, here's the grand approach. This way is for his grace's coach. There lies the bridge, and here's the clock. Observe the lion and the cock. The spacious court, the colonnade, and mark how wide the hall is made. The chimneys are so well designed, they never smoke in any wind. This gallery is contrived for walking, the windows are here for retire and talk in, the council chamber for debate, and all the rest are rooms of state." "Thanks, sir," cried I, "'tis very fine, but where'd you sleep or where'd you dine? I find by all you have been telling that 'tis a house, but not a dwelling."
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.